This issue of fuel in this country has long been a debating point that governments don't seem to want to engage in. Now, there's some figures out from the Department of, I think it's Climate Change and Energy. I wouldn't normally be quoting them, but Climate Change, Energy and the Environment. And that has revealed, these figures, that Australia only has 28 days of petrol supply in reserve as of July. We also only have 20 days of jet fuel, of all things, and 24 days of diesel. We're also meant to have oil stores equivalent to 90 days worth of net imports. That's under a global treaty that we signed up to in the 1970s, but we only have 49 days worth, not the 90 days required. Joining me now, someone who you'll know well, and I've interviewed plenty of times, who has raised serious concerns about this lack of supply, former independent South Australian Senator Rex Patrick. Good to see you again. How did we ever end up in this situation, Rex?
Well, it's an awful situation that we are in, and it's really the neglect of successive governments to deal with what is a national security issue. If there's a conflict, and it doesn't have to be a conflict with Australia, but something that disrupts our fuel supplies coming from the Straits of Hormuz or from Singapore, we're in real trouble. Most people might think, my car might run out of petrol, but that's actually not what the worry is. Most of our country relies on diesel fuel. That's what keeps all the trucks rolling, the trains rolling, that keep all of the supplies coming to us. And we know that, for example, supermarkets typically have about 10 days worth of dry food, something like 7 days of frozen. Our hospitals typically have about 3 days worth of drugs to keep the hospital running, and that can all come to a rapid stop if we disrupt our fuel supplies. 24 days of diesel is simply not enough.
I remember Jim Molan, the former head of, former senator and former military figure. He wrote a book warning about this. What is it about Canberra politicians in particular that they don't seem to worry or care about this? I mean, it would seem, Rex, to be completely obvious that it's not good enough that we have only, 2 operating oil refineries ourselves, but we rely totally upon those shipping lanes and supplies of imported fuel.
Yeah, look, we really need to address this problem. And look, during my time in the Senate did pass legislation to help save those 2 refineries, but also to try and increase supplies, but only up to 30 days. And it just seems that particular project, it was about $260 million worth, hasn't yet delivered results. But even so, it's nowhere near the 90 days that is required. And the problem is that we see defence ministers and prime ministers standing up in front of sexy fighter jets and sexy submarines and main battle tanks and assure the Australians that they're safe, where there's an underlying problem in relation to our fuel security and other things like industrial resilience. We know during COVID, that showed us how vulnerable we are. We saw what happened with toilet paper, and actually we make toilet paper here. When people start to worry that their supermarket's about to run out of food, it's going to be mayhem.
Growing up in South Australia where you are, and I lived in the southern suburbs and not that far from the Port Stanvac oil refinery, and you used to watch the oil tankers coming into Stanvac to have that oil distilled into petrol. Why do we think we don't need to do that anymore? Is it just too expensive for us to do it? Do the oil companies not want it done here because it would put up their costs? What's the problem with us making our own petrol?
Well, we have to have the reserves to be able to do that as well. What we've found is that our refineries can't compete with some of the mega refineries in places like Singapore, and the government has acted to try and at least prop up the remaining 2 refineries. But we really do need to deal with storage. We had a situation in 2018, Exercise Pitch Black, a major Air Force exercise, multinational exercise, and we actually ran out of aviation fuel because one ship from Singapore was was delayed. You know, that should have focused Defence's mind, but they just don't seem to want to address this problem. It's a critical problem. It's a problem that can manifest itself without us being involved in a conflict. It just involves conflict or disruption somewhere else.
You would think, given the global problems in the moment and the rise of China and all of the issues around that, you know, someone in Canberra would wake up and say, look, we better get this sorted out. I want to ask you also, you've raised some concerns about the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese's plan to amend the freedom of information laws. You used freedom of information a lot when you were a senator. What worries you about what the PM's trying to do here?
Well, in 2019, the Prime Minister came out and, when he was the opposition leader, came out and said that we needed to have more transparency in government. He's now introduced a bill that seeks to wrap a secrecy blanket around almost everything that is done at the top echelons of government and anything that might involve controversy. And everything that the government does, all the documents they produce for public purpose and on our coin, and we have a right to see what it is that government's doing. We've got to be able to participate in democracy, we've got to be able to scrutinise our government, and we've got to be able to judge our government. And you can't do that with information that they choose to release.
Well, one would think that those changes might struggle to get through your old place of work, the Senate, wouldn't they, Rex?
Well, this bill has no friends other than inside of government. So good on Susan Ley for standing up and saying that she will reject it. The Greens have said that, as has the crossbench. I'm a little wary. A week is a long time in politics, and this bill won't be dealt with this calendar year. So a few months is an eternity. But we've got to hope that the opposition and the crossbench parties hold out on this, because this would be devastating. You know, information is to democratic participation as water is to life. We all take water for granted until we can't get any, and that's exactly the situation we find ourselves in. This is an evil and likely unconstitutional bill, and shame on the Prime Minister for doing this. He's engaging in hypocrisy, having told the electorate in 2019 that he was all for open and transparent government.
Rex, good to see you still fired up.